Thank you so much, Danielle, and thank you, Carolyn, for your words yesterday. And I am deeply and profoundly humbled by those words. And it's wonderful to see that some of you have come back today to find out what's going on with Cheryl, I take it. Well, in our lecture yesterday, we saw that these 4 verbal codes that constitute the genre that we call preaching can be shaped in a great variety of ways. I gave you a rather lengthy handout and ran you through the gauntlet, if you will, of the most predominant styles or ways of fashioning our homiletical powers within these codes, these expectations that exist between sermon listeners and preachers. I also spent a little time helping us begin to see how each of these styles or ways of fashioning our homiletical powers shapes over time a congregation's understanding of truth, memory, religious experience, and theological worldview or mythos. At the end of our lecture yesterday, I provided us with a brief example of a preacher named Cheryl who discovered that a critical assessment of her styles of encoding the sermon genre might spark ideas for homiletical renewal and change. And today I want to return to this case study, if you will, and then do a brief examination also of do another small little case study examining Christian nationalist preaching, and see how reflection on these styles might be helpful for us, perhaps, in the renewal of our preaching, to get us reflecting a little bit on that, and also on how we respond to preaching that is currently shaping public opinion and even policy in our country. But first, I want to address a little question that I anticipate might arise for some of you after yesterday's lecture. And this is the "aren't we just all over the place" question? Or the question of stylistic consistency, if you will. In other words, I anticipate that some of you might say, well, some Sundays I preach this way, and others I preach that way. And I don't think you can peg me into only one of these styles in each of these codes. And to this I would say that, well, after more than 30 years now of engaging in critical homiletical diagnostic analysis with preachers who are preaching on a regular basis across nearly every tradition imaginable of preaching, I have found that every single preacher I have worked with might have occasional Airbnbs or timeshares within each of these codes. But each preacher typically has a home, has a default style in each of these codes that can be easily recognized through the analysis of maybe 10 to 15 sermons. Now, because pre-critical or non-critical homiletics tends to be the norm in many instances, the styles that most preachers settle into are often not intentionally chosen and developed. I sometimes call this default set of styles a preacher's operative homiletic. Decisions for one's default or an occasional use of another style are seldom made consciously and intentionally. Sometimes they are, but most of the time I've found that they're not. Most preachers' stylistic default or home base comes into existence through osmosis, if you will, or through the imitation of favorite preachers. I used to imitate almost directly my father in the pulpit. Or through doing what comes naturally, or through allowing oneself to be shaped over time by a tradition or simply by congregational affirmations, what they seem to like. And inconsistencies or visits to different styles then are usually driven by, occasional concerns. I'm preaching at a wedding, or textual concerns, biblical textual concerns sometimes will nudge us into a different pathway, but not often by conscious, practical theological decisions aimed at long-term renewal or change. Part of what critical homiletics requires of the preacher is the desire to rise above pre-critical and non-critical preaching altogether. This requires the willingness to gain some modicum of critical self-consciousness about how we preach or what we are doing with this unique genre of communication in all four of these codes at the very least. In short, it requires that a preacher wants to no longer be down under the task of preaching, but to somehow get on top of it in whatever ways are possible. Now, in the case study I presented then briefly yesterday, this was what occurred. The preacher I mentioned, named Cheryl, had begun a coaching process in which critical analysis of the four codes of preaching had been set into play. And although there were surely aspects of sermon content that would have been under consideration, I only noted issues here that emerged from the broad analysis of style in her work. With this in mind, let's return to this case study and see what's involved in this kind of critical homiletics of genre at the level of style. Now, I mentioned that Cheryl, an American Baptist preacher in a small town county seat congregation, decided consciously to make these stylistic changes in order to renew her preaching. In the semantic code, I noted that she wants to change from her usual defensive and apologetic style to a more conversational style of meaning-making. And in the scriptural code, she wants to change from her usual dynamic equivalent style to a more historical style, historical continuity style. In the cultural code, she wants to change from her usual dialectical style to a more separatist style. And in the theosymbolic code, she wants to change her theological worldview, if she can, from a permutational worldview to a more oppositional worldview. I'm going to come back through all of these. Now, the first question I raised yesterday is the all-important question. Why would Cheryl decide to make these changes? What's going on that makes her want to rework those expectations that have for years defined the genre of preaching for her? And this brings us to the first thing that preachers who make use of critical homiletics have to do, and that is to analyze the preaching situation. Bullet point number one. Cheryl had moved a couple of years earlier from an urban congregation that was very active in ministry with the homeless. In fact, her church there had actually housed a women's shelter in the church basement. The church, and after nearly 10 years of ministry in that urban congregation, in 2018, mind you, Cheryl moved to the rural county seat church that she pastored at the time she began to undergo homiletical coaching. Now, at the time, there was a growing awareness of migrant detention centers located in rural areas around the southern and southwestern parts of the United States. And her church building was only a few miles from an increasingly active and very large ICE detention center. And perhaps due to the high immigrant population in her town, due to a couple of large meatpacking facilities, and the political winds of the time, ICE agents had become very active in the community. Now, after leading her congregation in a year-long study of the concept of hospitality to the stranger, several members of her church began to join in some vigils that were taking place at this detention facility to demand that it be closed. They also began a ministry of visitation with inmates that led to a larger ministry of hospitality and to conversations about sanctuary. The church joined with other churches to develop ministries and forms of activism. They developed a small movement to stop illegal traffic stops that were based on skin color. They shaped a program of legal services for immigrants and a program providing child care and fostering services for the children of parents who were being detained or deported. Nora Tubbs Tisdale, in her wonderful book, Preaching as Local Theology and Folk Art, that I mentioned in my first lecture, provides a wonderful method for analyzing not only a congregation's situation, but the key theological ideas that are important in a congregation as well. And after performing this kind of analysis, Cheryl began to realize that the theological messages she was used to preaching in her prior congregation, well, those messages needed to change. Those messages centered on ideas of comfort and hope in the midst of suffering, victory over sin and evil in one's life, one's personal life, especially addiction and domestic abuse, and loss of economic stability and loss of health. And the need in her urban church, profound need to learn how to praise and express gratitude on the spot. Well, these ideas, which were important in that church and its ministry among the homeless and the abused, were not, she felt, what her new congregation was needing to hear for the most part. Their work with migrants had turned them outward significantly. And she had determined that words that addressed more directly the systems and the principalities and powers around them needed to be heard, as well as words that helped her congregation both learn how to resist and decide to resist these systems, and to stand firm as a sanctuary congregation, a beacon of light on a hill, indeed a counter-cultural refuge. Well, with this situation-based content analysis in mind, Cheryl turned then to the second thing that a preacher must do to allow critical homiletics to help them renew their preaching. She must carefully analyze her own style of preaching in relation to that situation. And for this, she used the 4 codes. Imagine. Well, in the semantic code, she discovered that probably because of her Southern Baptist background, before she switched to the American Baptist denomination, and the influence of Christian apologetics on her preaching, she had a strong defensive style. When preaching to her urban congregation in ministry to the homeless and the abused, she had defended with all her might ideas that celebrated each person's infinite value, God's unconditional love and mercy, and each person's ability to change and recover from trauma. These were wonderful ideas, and she felt the need in that context to defend them with the last ounce of her energy. But in her new situation, in which hospitality to the migrant stranger was so central, she felt the need for her new congregation to find ways to learn from these migrants who God was for them and to discern together somehow in interhuman conversation what in the world was emerging in their midst in that situation as God's truth for all of them together. She decided, therefore, for a more conversational style, to put together perhaps a pre-sermon Bible study of all things, and when possible to include immigrants and longtime church members in this group. And she also decided very radically as well that she'd like to host a talk-back session perhaps twice a month. Well, moving on, in the scriptural code, her self-analysis showed that she used a dynamic equivalence style. Now, she attributed this to the preaching she had heard when she was growing up, but also to the influence of devotional Bible studies on her life, especially when she was a teenager and in college, both of which emphasized dynamic equivalence as a way to read the Bible. If the text said something, our task is to do it, or whatever is dynamically equivalent to those words on the page. God is revealed right there on that page in its words and its proposition, and our job is of remembering is a task then of simple imitation. That's what she had learned, and that's what she was doing. Now, although she wants to keep some of the simplicity and clarity of this kind of thinking, she also now wants to preach in a way that puts her listeners into a shared history with those ancient people and events witnessed to in the biblical text. And this, she hopes, might be a way of connecting with how God loves and cares for and guides people who are in diaspora, who are in exile, and who are ministering to people who are in exile. She wants her church to align itself with God's people throughout history who have suffered and struggled in situations where they are persecuted, where they are outsiders, where they are strangers in need of hospitality, and also givers of hospitality. Another big change. In the cultural code, she discovered that in her past preaching, she had a real knack for what yesterday we called the dialectical style. In that preaching, she saw herself as somebody who really had a kind of clairvoyance, if you will, so that she could find and see God's presence in small, ordinary, even and unexpected moments of mercy or healing. These she so often discovered amongst the homeless men and women around her, or among the abused women at the shelter, whose small acts of kindness to her or one another became vivid pictures of the gospel within lived experience. But in her new situation, she wants to use a separatist style to emphasize the countercultural nature of the gospel and the countercultural nature of what her church wants to do in this context, showing how the gospel is made manifest in the actions and words of Christians like her own congregation members and their immigrant friends who were now resisting together principalities and powers in this world. She wants to celebrate more distinctive Christian virtues and practices that might appear, in fact, foolish in the eyes of most of the world. Another big change. And then in the theosymbolic code, she discovered that her proclivity in her past preaching was in fact toward what we called yesterday a permutational worldview. The bad news for her was often presented as a kind of foil to set off the superabundant good news of God's victorious power in our lives. And while this seemed appropriate for her urban audience in the mission and the shelter, it seemed to lack enough clarity in her new situation about the bad news of those demonic systems in the world and the need to oppose those systems as Christians. And so she decides to do what she can to shift toward a more oppositional style, encouraging her listeners to accept the challenge, to do things, to claim God's future in the here and now through acts of social witness and justice. And this brings us to the end then of the second element of what critical homiletics requires of preachers. First, situational analysis. Second, sermon analysis with an eye towards style, and some decisions to make some changes to renew her preaching. At this juncture, I like to say that a preacher like Cheryl has developed a strategic, practical theology of preaching. She has surveyed her situation and her place in it and decided on a way to go, a direction, a strategy. And this strategy now has clear theological guideposts to guide the way. What she needs as a third and final step in renewing her preaching using critical homiletics is a tactical, practical theology. Strategies are the long view. Tactics are, what do I do next? And here she encounters such questions as, do I need to read more about how to do these things? Are there books, resources, articles? Do I need to listen to certain podcasts? Watch certain YouTubes? Should I involve myself in certain kinds of continuing education? Do I need further coaching for accountability? What should I do first, second, third? Well, under the continued supervision of her preaching coach, Cheryl developed a set of tactics. And tactics, we know, always have to be adjustable. But because Cheryl had decided to implement an actual structural shift in her preaching in order to change her semantic coding, right? She wants to institute a pre-sermon brainstorming group, sermon brainstorming group, if you will, and a post-sermon response time. Well, she made thinking this through and working on that first priority. At the same time, though, in order to address the changes she wants to make in her scriptural coding, she began to read more deeply into the biblical theology and ethics of hospitality to the stranger, and to study especially biblical resources on diaspora and exile, especially those, in her case, of Walter Brueggemann. To think more clearly about how to engage in cultural coding that is more separatist in nature, well, Cheryl read books by William Willimon and Stanley Hauerwas, and by my dear friend Charles Campbell, who was here, I think, about 5 years ago. With an eye on shifting from a permutational to an oppositional worldview, Cheryl was challenged to listen to a cluster of sermons by Jeremiah Wright and by Anthony Campolo and by the wonderful Yvonne Delk. She also met with members of her Christian Education Committee to begin planning several adult classes that would build on the earlier class on hospitality, and she began conversations with the church board on the possibility of sharing their worship space and fellowship hall with a fledgling Spanish-speaking congregation. Well, before moving on, then, let's review the 3 steps Cheryl has gone through to use a critical homiletic to renew her preaching. First, analysis of her situation. Second, analysis of her preaching, including making informed decisions regarding possible changes in both content and style. And third, deciding on a set of tactics to get from point A to point B. Cheryl's process is one very important way in which we can see a critical homiletics of the sermon genre working to help us renew preaching. But besides developing a strategic, practical theology for your preaching to renew it through a critical genre analysis, might there be other more playful ways to do this? More playful ways to take our little stylistic possibilities chart from yesterday's lecture and use it to renew our preaching? Well, certainly. In my book, Mashup Religion, Pop Music and Theological Invention, I suggest that preachers might envision themselves like DJs. You know, DJs who have turntables in front of them here, you know? And who reach into their crates and pull out records, pull out styles, whatever, in the different styles, and juxtapose them in new and unexpected ways in their preaching. Ways that might renew their preaching in a kind of playful way, if you will, or an exploratory way. In this way of thinking, a preacher might intentionally disrupt their usual way of preaching and a congregation's expectations for the genre of preaching by either introducing a different way of, let's say, organizing the codes, perhaps, or styling on or morphing their usual style by preaching it in a new way or a different way or nudging it forward in some way. In the first instance, let's say Cheryl and her congregation typically expect that the preacher will organize the codes in a sermon by starting their sermons and starting each sequence of a sermon perhaps with the biblical text. This is how expository preaching is sometimes defined. The preacher starts always with the biblical text and then moves to, the other codes take second place. But she might make an intentional choice to change this. Why not reach into the crate and let the theosymbolic code lead the way every Sunday, like a good doctrinal preacher, right? And emphasize a theological symbol or framework that will be preached in each movement of the sermon and then, just arrive at the biblical text last in each sequence or even in the entire sermon. It's possible. So these kinds of organizational shifts might be another way to think about this. Or in the second instance, the preacher might want to morph the way they already engage a style, sort of nudge it forward a little bit, change it a little bit more. The preacher might further develop a style they already have. For instance, after Cheryl has used this conversational style of semantic coding for a while and has implemented this pre-sermon roundtable, if you will, in a talk-back session, she might morph this style further by, let's say, inviting members of that pre-sermon roundtable to come up into the pulpit occasionally, inviting brief testimonials that relate directly to what the sermon is about. Just go ahead and get the community, let this conversation just come right on up into the pulpit. Ooh, this is really getting radical. Or she might occasionally invite members of the youth group who love to use their iPhones and other devices to make quick video interviews of church members and others regarding the idea that's being preached. And then these might be played during the sermon as part of the cultural coding, or as a build-up to the sermon. We watch these little videos, and then here's the sermon right in the middle of that, just as a way of getting other voices into the mix. Well, these are new ways of expanding, or what I call in that book, remixing, what is already a commitment in the to her conversational style. She's just going to mix it up a little differently. So, what am I saying here? I'm saying that once a genre is understood, once we begin to get our hands onto and our heads wrapped around a genre, it can be morphed, it can be styled on. Once a preacher understands what goes into the genre we call preaching, and how we as a preacher, me as a preacher, how I'm positioned within that genre, I can begin to explore all kinds of new ways to style on what I already do in order to renew it, to deepen it, to make it more accessible, more enjoyable. Well, I think it now might be a good time to re-emphasize what I've been arguing up to this point, and that is that critical homiletics, in its treatment of preaching as a unique genre and in its most basic form, as a way just to analyze the way that your preaching can be responsive to the expectations of your listeners, well, this kind of work is your friend, especially if you're trying to renew your preaching in a unique situation. It can help you get on top of your preaching, become more intentional, more aware of the ways your preaching can best support your larger ministry. But as you can see, this requires a real commitment of time and effort by preachers. Because of my belief in this kind of work, I spent a good bit of my time in the second half of my career experimenting with and studying the best ways to coach preaching. And before his untimely death, my colleague and dear friend Dale Andrews and I were principal investigators on two large projects that were designed to simply explore best practices for homiletical coaching. The published results of these efforts came out last year in the book Learning Together to Preach: How to Become an Effective Preaching Coach. Now, to democratize the coaching of preachers, we developed a training program that taught preachers how to run peer groups with each other and to engage in critical homiletical coaching without even the need for expert intervention. I cannot say enough about the importance of coaching or some other form of accountability if preaching is to be renewed in these ways. And this brings me to the proverbial $60 question. Is this kind of critical homiletical reflection something working preachers will actually do? Isn't it easier to hunker down in what seems to be already at least practical and doable? Busy preachers have slim margins. I'm anticipating what I'm going to hear in the feedback sessions. We have slim margins for reflection on preaching in this in-depth kind of way. And most of us have settled into practices that they seem to work all right, practices that have become habitual and in many instances seem to provoke very good feedback. Thank you. Well, this kind of affirmation-based homiletics often seems just fine. It's usually grounded in the most workable ways to organize material, time, effort, and feedback. So why mess with a good thing? I hope we can have some conversation around these questions, perhaps in the question and answer time. From my perspective, I think that most critical homileticians wonder if we're not just seeing that small, highly motivated preaching zealot in our D-Min certificate, continuing education, and coaching programs. A very small cohort of preachers who are willing to invest the time and this kind of time and effort into what it takes to do this work. No matter how small this cohort is, the people we see often fall roughly into these categories. I don't want to pigeonhole anyone, but these categories typically. First, we sometimes see preachers amidst a career change or who have made a change but need help sorting out a new pathway forward in the pulpit. Something is just not quite fitting a new situation. This, of course, was Cheryl's primary circumstance. Second, though, we sometimes see preachers who have experienced either personal or congregational trauma of some sort, or those whose church suddenly finds itself in a difficult situation in a community that they could not have ever anticipated. This was also Cheryl's church's situation to some extent. Leah Shade speaks about this in a church, in one of her books, a church that experienced fracking suddenly beginning just down the street. Third, we occasionally see preachers whose interest has been piqued through conversation with others who've gone through this kind of work and have set new goals and are learning something from it. This, at least one other preacher in Cheryl's community sought out critical homiletical coaching after she had been through it. Fourth, we sometimes see those who are literally bored. They have preached the same texts for years, and their messages adjust somewhat, but not very much, and their style to them personally seems to be just stale. These preachers show up for critical homiletical reflection to explore options that will simply wake up their preaching ministry for them, and we hope for their listeners. So critical homiletical reflection at the level of genre study is potentially helpful in a wide variety of ways, but there's no way to force preachers to do this kind of work. It is voluntary and requires some real commitment to renewing one's preaching. Where does this come from? How can we encourage more of it? Can it even be more streamlined somehow? Made more accessible, more doable? Can our churches provide more educational space for this kind of work? Well, these are the kinds of crucial questions that all of us who are engaged in critical homiletics ask ourselves almost every day. So before concluding, I want to do two more things. First, I want to draw your attention briefly to 5 strands of research by critical homiletic scholars that are, I think, very important going forward as we attempt to streamline, support, and build on this kind of work. I believe that it's very important that this work continues to be done. And then I want to provide one more case study, as I promised, to say a word about Christian nationalist preaching. First, what kinds of scholarship do we need considering the critical homiletics of genre? First, we need books and other resources that help preachers link their preaching deeply with contextual issues and contextual analysis. How can I best and most easily analyze my context with preaching in mind? So more of what Nora was trying to help people do. And how do I decide what kind of preaching best meets differing contextual issues such as racism and immigration and child labor practices, fracking, poverty, and on and on and on? Some of these resources already exist, but many of them need updating, retooling, better and more up-to-date examples, and we just need more of them. Second, we need research and writing that makes us more aware of how preaching is linked with congregational leadership. Notice that I said leadership and not administration. We are not interested in preaching that helps us finance the new church bus. But we need to understand better how it is that preaching leads congregations through setting a leadership tone and style, cultivating various key message systems, shaping theological frameworks for belief and for action, and creating and supporting church cultures. So much of this stylistic work shapes a church's inner culture or participates in that shaping. We have hunches about some of this, but the actual empirical research is very thin. Third, we need more research that helps preachers ensure that the homiletical styles they choose are managed well from an ethical standpoint. For instance, how might that conversational style, if used incorrectly, disempower Cheryl as a woman preacher in her situation? How can she avoid abdicating her pastoral authority by inviting everyone else into her pulpit ministry? Or in the cultural code, how can her use of a separatist and countercultural approach avoid forms of Christian superiority and exclusivism? How does she plan to account for the fact that most of her church members still live pretty privileged lives and enjoy lifestyles that are hardly countercultural in any way of thinking? And isn't being countercultural simply a feature of the dominant American culture? We all want to be countercultural. How can she avoid these kinds of issues? So each style within each of these 4 codes has issues that its ethical deconstruction must continue to address. We could use more and more research and writing in these areas. Fourth, as an extension perhaps of number 3, we need scholarship that is suggestive of how an ethical deconstruction of this genre can also be committed to the development of new emergent styles in any or all of these 4 codes. Jake Myers' work is very suggestive in this way. He's currently working on a project like this. In his recent work, he works an ethical deconstruction on what I have called the artistic style in the inductive mode. And he lays bare its commitment to various hegemonic interests. And in its place, he proposes something called conductive preaching instead of inductive preaching, and begins to develop what, in fact, this style looks like and sounds like as it emerges from the ashes of inductive homiletics. This kind of work, it seems to me, could be accomplished in relation to every style I identified in yesterday's lecture with great fruitfulness. Fifth, we need scholarship that analyzes the styles or ways that homiletical powers are being fashioned among preachers who, for better or worse, are having a tremendous influence in the public realm and on social media. In what ways can genre analysis help us understand the ways that preaching is influencing, in fact, social and political consciousness today? And this brings us then to our final case study, a little analysis of Christian nationalist preaching during this election cycle using the 4 codes of all things. So, in closing, a few words about Christian nationalist preaching, which has now become a very strong and very persuasive force on the religious right, and what implications, if any, this kind of preaching might have on our thinking about how we preach. Now, my analysis of Christian nationalist preachers is very small and limited, the group that I looked at, focused mainly on the preaching of Lance Wallnau, who predicted Donald Trump's 2016 election win when he was still a long shot, South Carolina preacher and pastor to Donald Trump, Mark Burns. You may be familiar with any or all of these. California megachurch pastor Che On, Reverend Mario Bramnick of New Wine Ministries Church in Cooper City, Florida, South Carolina pastor Doug Sheets, a prominent preacher in the New Apostolic Reformation or Dominionist movement, which I think all of us need to get to know as well as we can, and then Cindy Jacobs a little bit from Morning Star Ministries. So a limited cohort for this particular analysis. Now, my analysis points us to these following elements of style, if you will. First, in the semantic code, these Christian nationalists are highly, highly defensive in their style, leaving little or no room for critique or ambiguity. They assert a bold identification of dominionist doctrines and Christian nationalist prophecy with absolute truth, with the singular goal of instituting a nation completely ruled by Christians and a certain set of Christian laws. Christian nationalist sermons are almost violently, at times, defensive in tone and in style. Meaning making is clearly a one-way street, with all options leading into ever more terrible and terrifying places of depravity and despair, reminiscent in some ways of Edwards' sinners in the hands of an angry God. There is but a singular pathway to salvation and hope, and it must be defended at all costs from being diluted. Unlike Edwards, however, there's often an implication that even violent means might be used to ensure that this singular truth becomes reality. So final and universal truth for these preachers involves participation in an apocalyptic narrative that aims at a singular form of national Christian identity. Well, what are our options considering this way of using the defensive semantic style by these preachers? Well, perhaps we can have a conversation on this, but some of us will say, well, let's fight fire with fire. It's time for all of us with a different vision of the Christian message to rise up and defend vigorously an ethic of love and hospitality and universal humanization and nonviolence and peace and on and on. Just like these nationalists who claim that we are the enemy, we should assert that this is the enemy. And we should defend another vision, another narrative that's in danger of being destroyed. In other words, we should meet this defensive style by these preachers with one of our own. Well, that's one way to go. Others will opt for the pluralism of the assertive style. Christian nationalism is one somewhat warranted paradigm of Christian thought, among others. And our goal is to simply assert our own well-warranted paradigm, and may the best one win, or at least thrive. Without stooping then to strategies of demonization, the goal is to assert clearly and with as much attractive power an alternative vision for life as Christians. Or perhaps the conversational style is best. We may have people in our midst, in our church, who are imbibing this nationalism through social media and elsewhere, and we need to find ways to engage in some kind of interhuman dialogue and conversation that susses out the reasons for this way of thinking, and which looks for new plateaus of potential or actual solidarity and ways to live life together. Or perhaps we become artists, pointing to unexpected, shared experiences of gospel across all forms of political and social consciousness, encouraging individual insights into a common social and personal project at an entirely different level, and shared commitments by all of us to real human flourishing. Well, these are clear options, I hope you see, in terms of styles of meaning making in the face of this Christian nationalist agenda. This is just the semantic code. How will we decide which one? In both the scriptural code and the cultural code, my analysis shows that there is a fair amount of dissimulation or camouflage, if you will, occurring in much of this Christian nationalist preaching. Scriptural coding, let me say what I mean by this. Scriptural coding is driven strongly by what I would call theological transformation, or the preacher's theological hermeneutic. Preaching texts are chosen and interpreted through very narrow theological lenses, largely as fulfilling prophecy, which is understood in a singular way. But much of this doctrinal exegesis or eisegesis is camouflaged as history. And listeners are invited to think of themselves as aligning their world-saving work with the inevitable march of God's prophetic history. In a similar way, in the cultural code, it's almost everything is done in what I call the identificationist style. The gospel is directly identified with certain hegemonic and dominant cultural forces: anti-abortionist views, anti-feminist views, anti-GLBTQ views, anti-wokeism, and anti-immigration, and on and on. These are dominant cultural. The gospel is just identified wholesale with these dominant cultural forces. And yet, this style is camouflaged as being separatist in nature. This dominant cultural force is presented as if it were a beleaguered Christian witness, a beacon of light that's under constant ridicule, a motley crew of fools, if you will, for Christ on a righteous mission in the culture. And again, this raises questions regarding our possible responses. For instance, we might mirror this approach a little bit, but pull off the camouflage. Perhaps use a liberation theology to reclaim ancient prophetic history in a way that foregrounds the actual victims of history: the poor, the strangers, the migrants, the marginalized, whether racial, sexual, otherwise. And we might also use a separatist style of cultural coding in a similar way, treating, though, right-wing politics as the dominant cultural force that it is, along with much of left-wing politics, I might say. And then working to identify a genuine countercultural and separatist form of religious experience that challenges and resists elements of both. And again, looking at your possibilities chart, other options might come to mind. These were just two that struck my fancy. Finally, in the theosymbolic code, the permutational style predominates among Christian nationalist preachers. There's plenty of bad news identified almost entirely with the current so-called deep state-controlled government and urban centers as cesspools of moral depravity. But much of this, however, exists as a setup for the preacher's excited and sometimes ecstatic presentation of revival as underway. A movement that is fulfilling all prophecy historically, unleashed in the here and now, in this room, in this moment, requiring nothing but submission and total commitment. And in Pentecostal forms of Christian nationalist preaching, this is where anointing and ecstatic shouting is often introduced. All of this is to emphasize that this revival is a superabundant reality, beyond our wildest imaginings, that's already underway, and there are plenty of signs. Well, how do we do theosymbolic work in our sermons in light of this usage of the theosymbolic worldview? Are we in the mood to fight fire with fire and imitate this permutational worldview yet with different content? Perhaps. We could identify similar stereotypical yet clear evils, right? The grotesque systemic evils all around us, as Chuck Campbell said in his lecture 5 years ago. And we could use this in a similar way to set up the preaching of a different kind of permutational revival, of nonviolent resistance, a revival of universal openness and inclusion, a revival of superabundant generosity and welcome. Well, perhaps this is the way to go. Or maybe we want to stay with the bad news and unpack its complexity better as tensive stylists and encourage each other to hold the line in face of these terrible evils around us. Or perhaps we want to tune our response closely to the different kinds of evil we confront as oppositional or equilibrist stylists. Again, we have options. So the key, I'm through with my case study, the key in all instances is the genre analysis of what we're up against if we're to make informed decisions about how we address it in our situations. So knowing how things are being done by those whose work we want to address helps us to think about how we do what we do, is what I'm trying to say. So learning how to analyze the preaching of others is crucial if we're going to think about this in the public domain. And this is where critical homiletics, even in its broad analysis of these 4 codes and their styles, might be of some help as we try to get on top of our preaching practice, even within the framework of doing public theology during an election cycle. This brings us to the end of our lecture time together. I have argued that going on 70 years of critical homiletics of the sermon genre has an important role to play in the renewal of our preaching. In these lectures, I have returned to the verbal codes or expectations that define the genre of what I call the congregational sermon, and reviewed the most typical styles within each code, and suggested that an analysis of these codes and styles might help preachers develop strategic and tactical, practical theologies of preaching that could renew their own work situationally. Much, much more might be said, of course, about all of these things, but all good things must come to an end. I look forward to our conversation and engaging your questions. Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you.
Thank you. Yeah. Hi, I'm Dick Burnett, class of '83 here, and I remember the pews. And I love the chairs, and I love the space. Mr. McClure, thank you very much. I out of duty, stand to ask a question related to a reconsideration of Edwards And that's simply, his spirit is everywhere here. So that is simply to say, unless the pluralistic genre and the artistic genre are in fact synonyms, merged together, and I don't think they are.
Absolutely.
I don't think they're mashed up, as you like to say.
Be.
Then I would argue that Edwards, in fact, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God notwithstanding, read in junior year of high school in all public schools in America, even today, that in fact, that includes his aesthetic gift, which is his greatest gift, along with math, which I don't understand, but the aesthetic. So say a little bit about Edwards, a little bit more with regard to that,
well,
please.
I'm not an Edwards scholar, but I agree with you that if I were to, Edwards was somebody who would probably be more overall someone I would put in the more artistic style. That particular sermon, I think, is a bit of an outlier, and speaks to a particular contextual situation that he's working with. So I was using it not as a way of thinking in its entirety about the defensive style, but thinking of the idea of being in the hands of an angry God, being something that I think Christian nationalist preachers definitely put forward in a very strong and electrifying way. But I agree with you. Edwards is a much more complex. I taught with Amy Powell at Louisville, and so she would have stood and said the exact same thing you did, I think, and tried to upbraid me for my misuse of Edwards. So many apologies.
She's on the board of the Edwards Center here.
Oh, good. Yes. Right. Yes.
If anyone wants, all of his sermons are now online.
Yes.
They have actually gotten all
Oh, wow.
sermons online.
Awesome.
We got another tranche of Edwards material.
Yeah.
A gift of the donor, so they're working through that latest batch of letters, etc. But anyway.
Hey, Elizabeth Marie Melchona,
Yeah,
class of 2006. I serve an Episcopal congregation in North Carolina in a university context.
Wow.
And I was intrigued as you were talking about the 5 strands of research, thinking about preaching being linked with congregational leadership and the necessity of research in that area. And I'm curious, how can working preachers, because we're asking ourselves that as a preaching team, how are we using our preaching to try to lead and shape community culture? How can working preachers, and with whom might working preachers be able to participate in that empirical research, and what does it look like? Who's doing it?
Yeah, most of the there was a period of time when congregational study and preaching were flirting with each other. They never really, and I think Nora Tisdale's work came out of that to some extent. And the sort of semiotics of culture within congregations and how preaching participates in that and also shapes that a lot. Right now, I'm not familiar, and anyone else in the room who wants to mention other books in that way, there are books on context analysis and preaching, but the kind of empirical research that needs to go on would involve people like yourself, and as I would envision, would involve interviewing people in we did this listening to listeners to sermons study years back, where we listened to those in congregations who were hearing sermons, and although our intent was not to sort of get at leadership issues, there were a lot of them that came out of that. But I think to do that kind of study where you interview sermon listeners in congregations, along with interviews with the pastors, and trying to have, and maybe even holding focus groups of pastors who could then talk about their perceptions about ways in which the development of a congregational culture are, what they're doing participates in that work. I'm I'm laying these codes out and talking about how they shape things. Well, they're also responding to things, right? They're responding to expectations that are already there. And so there's this, which is why I use the language of symbolic interaction. There's always this push and pull, this give and take going on. And I think it's perceived by people in churches, it's perceived by pastors, but we've never sort of parsed it out carefully. And so if you wanted to get something like that started, I'd love to hear about it. I really right now don't know of anyone who's doing that, engaged in that particular kind of really qualitative research study. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jordan Baker. I'm a current student here, second year MDiv, seeking ordination in the ELC Lutheran Church. I was wondering, when congregations have a certain energy or being pulled in a certain direction, perhaps a good direction, how we discern whether we should align our preaching style to sort of feed that energy, to give it more gas, versus using our preaching style as like a counterbalance to the energy of a congregation, again, even when it's being pulled in a good direction. And I'm just curious about what you might say.
Yeah, I love that question because it emphasizes precisely the kinds of decisions that I think are crucial for pastors to be, trying to make. And it's also where, and I hear this so much in homiletical coaching, so much of what we do when we coach preachers, I hope, is listen to them and what they perceive is going on. Now, if I were coaching you and you said, I perceive that this congregation wants to nudge itself in a good direction, then I would begin a conversation with you about how can your preaching participate in that? Because you're already making a value judgment that's positive. And so I want to hear more about that, and we want to talk then about not just the content of your preaching, but the style. What have they been experiencing, and what's needed if they're going to move forward in that particular way. So I think those are precisely the kinds of self-aware, critical homiletical questions that I would be looking for and be excited about working with you on, if that were what we were working on together. Those are the most engaging moments, if you will, in homiletical coaching is, I think this church could do this. And then, a lot of work, a lot of reflection opens up on that. Well, how can I as a preacher participate in that, or nudge it or help it or work with that, But then there are also those moments when we say, this church really is burning itself out by doing this particular, and then we've got another set of questions. How do we think about a way of preaching that could, open up a new way forward and so on. So those are precisely the kinds of questions. I don't think there's a pat answer. We'd have to really be on the ground together. I'd have to listen you into speaking deeply about what you perceive those possibilities were. And then we'd start to see, I think, some ways in which preaching could work with it. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much, Professor McClure, for these wonderful lectures. I'm Awad Andi Mikhail, Dean of Chapel, and a lecturer in theology, so my question is a bit of a theological one. I take it that you're building on Niebuhr's Christ and Culture as one of the resources for creating your typology, and I'm wondering, how do you see yourself going beyond or nuancing or working against his, obviously there are ways you're drawing on him in an appreciative way, but how do you see yourself going beyond or diverging from him? And more generally, how do you see your typology? How do you deal with kind of the built-in challenges and limitations of any kind of typology, given that you're trying to find ways of nuancing? I have some ideas of, I think, what you have in mind, but I would love to hear you speak about that.
Right. Well, there are huge limitations. This is the cultural code that you're referring to, where Niebuhr's work, when I wrote the book, was very influential, and the critiques from Hauerwas and others had not yet appeared on the scene. So it bears the limitations of that typology. And yes, all typologies. My biggest fear is that it's going to box people in a particular way. I think there's a lot of crosstalk between all of those. I think, actually, that some of the later critiques of Niebuhr's work show up best in the ways that preaching is a kind of hybrid, practical theological a way of doing theology and doing theological ethics, really, that moves, in and through and across these particular categories in some really creative ways. So they're really kind of heuristic devices to sort of draw out tendencies and so on, the way that I set them up. The limitations of it, as I talk about it, I'm aware that my focus, especially in this lecture, was on how what something called gospel is, how it's being placed in relation to, culture and human experience. But there are a lot of other messages besides gospel messages within preaching that are placed, that are coming out also, anti-gospel, for instance, and other things. So it's limited in that way as also, and also it doesn't get at what content analysis of the cultural code gets at, and that is there's the cultural code is laden with stereotypes quite often, so that we only identify the gospel with a very narrow kind of culture that's identifiable by our listeners. And so the theology of culture, I would hope, takes us more deeply into thinking about how all of the little tiny references in a sermon to culture, in humor, in the way that we handle music that's referred to, the stereotypical family that we present in our sermons. What does family look like? So sports references, all these things that are laced with, and some of them gendered, some of them. So there's a lot more happening there than could be gotten at, certainly with any kind of a typology, and especially Niebuhr's. I haven't really done, all that much work within that, within my work on the cultural code, and trying to think about how some of the critiques of Niebuhr's work going forward would enhance it or make it better. And I would love to hear from you on any ideas you have about that. I think, for instance, I'm actually lumping two of his categories together in the dialectical model. I mean, there's Christ of culture and Christ above culture, for me, are, one of them looks for deep coordinates within culture, and points of synthesis, and the other tries to find those sort of pinnacle notions of how culture and religion actually meet and hug each other and hold each other and so on. So I've oversimplified even Niebuhr's categories, I'm afraid.
Up here and then back here. So Jake.
I'm Susan Townsley. I'm a working preacher up in Kennebunkport, Maine, and on the Andover-Newton Advisory Council. Many years ago, I conducted a survey of clergy in New England to find out who they considered the leading light among active clergy were. And then I went back and interviewed those clergy around a series of questions. But one of the things that surfaced is leading light clergy all understood that the preaching moment is no longer confined to the pulpit. And especially as our congregations are getting smaller and smaller, paying attention to all the other preaching moments is really critical.
Yeah.
So I'd love to just hear you noodle a little bit about how some of your work might help those of us who are trying to pay attention to other preaching moments.
Yes. Yes, homiletics has legs, and I think to some extent that's what you've said defines to some extent everything that I've just been talking about, and that is that we live as preachers. We live in these things. We don't just learn about them and like here are ways you can handle illustrations and do these kinds of things. We live within within what it means to be talking about human experience and where God is and who we are as God's people. So for me, throughout the week, every aspect of the sermon, looking at the semantic code, what are the ideas and messages and thoughts in this congregation that I'm hearing that need to be brought into my preaching. I'm always doing that. What are the experiences that are being had and that we're dealing with, that we're up against, that need to be addressed, or that what kinds of understandings of the biblical text, are we, and how are we as a congregation thinking about these sacred texts? And so all these things for me they're not just things we learn about. It's what we're swimming in with folks. And I years ago, wrote a book called The Round Table Pulpit, where I wanted to say that I think that the kind of authority that we need to have in today's church is relational authority. And the best way to build relational authority around the pulpit, for me, was to think of ways in which we could, get actual input from lay people, from the people that we work with and live with, in our sermons, so that becomes even more present, even more active, even more conscious and more intentional. So I don't know what the study is you're referring to, but it sounds like it's got a lot of wisdom from my perspective in it. And I think it addresses maybe the congregational leadership issue again. That way of thinking comes back around to then leadership, which is a really rough word. The concept of Führer hovers around the word leader. So it's just trying to think about even other ways to think about how we lead.
Hi, I'm John Tiro, 09 ELCA pastor in Knoxville, Tennessee. And I'm wondering what might be an intersection of tone of presentation or person of the presenter with style of what's presented. And part of why I'm wondering is I've noticed that sometimes a sermon that visibly connects with people at 9, not so much at 11. And it might be that we all just had a starchy brunch between services, right. But I am beginning, in light of your talks, to wonder if I might have two congregations with distinct homiletical needs.
Yes, right, yeah. Yeah, you might have two separate churches within one church. And that raises, another set of questions about how one addresses style. To the question of tone, I'm very conscious of how tone works. You could tell, perhaps, as I presented some of these styles, that I would change my own tone a little bit around each one to try to help you to grasp what they are. And I think it's absolutely essential. There are, And I would say, of course, that there are other codes besides these verbal codes that I'm addressing, which can be sort of parsed out even from just reading a sermon for the most part, that are caught up with, congregational expectations in particular locations. There are certain codes at 9 o'clock, not beyond these verbal codes. There are certain codes about tone, style, where you preach. Are you up there? Are you down here? How do So there are a lot of sort of even congregation specific, but within congregations, sets of expectations for different services that we as preachers know only too well. So beyond these 4 codes, all I'm trying to say is there are lots of others that, and of course Danielle's work is mining these within traditions, other traditions. But that, for me, would be also a part of this assessment of congregational leadership as well to some extent. How do we, leadership would involve some kind of elasticity, if you will, around, especially some of the non-linguistic codes, and that we have to really be constantly aware of. Your chapel experience here, I'm looking at the drum kit and, these kinds of things. These are caught up with a whole different set of cultural codes and other kinds of codes that are expected by different people. I hope that leans into your question a little bit. I'm not sure I'm answering anything, but it's wonderful.
So we have 2 questions, and I'm going to do this because we're almost out of time. Ask each of you to pose your question, and then John lets you respond.
Okay, fine.
Hi, I'm Elaine Ellis Thomas. I'm an Episcopal priest and pastor in Hoboken, New Jersey. Before that, I was in Charlottesville, Virginia. There is a trend in social media, particularly right now, that if there's some cataclysmic event, so an extrajudicial police killing or migrant separation on the border or whatever, to say, if your preacher is not preaching X on Sunday, you need to leave. And as someone who tends to preach with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other, how do we avoid falling into that trap of being an issue? Every week you could come up with something that's a current event, and that does not feel faithful to the arc of leading a congregation into better understanding of the gospel. So I'm just curious about what you might say about that.
Thank you. My name is Christine Housel. I'm a graduate of Berkeley and Yale in 2000, and I live in Geneva, Switzerland, and have been working with the ecumenical movement there through the WCC and WSCF, World Student Christian Federation, which we should all know more about because the archives are housed here. My question is, and I've recently gotten into the subject of the ethics of emerging and digital technologies. And so my question is, have you begun to grapple with the implications of large language models, AIs, as people increasingly receive sermons from AIs or influenced by AIs and our prompts to them? Thank you.
Yeah. I'll start there and then go this direction. On the AI side, I know that Casey Thornburg Sigmund has been working on that topic, and she was a graduate student of mine, and she's looking at it from a process theological perspective, and which raises some interesting questions about what kinds of possibilities are there, but also the things that can go deeply wrong, and how AI does not necessarily have the kind of steerage, if you will, that might be required for us to think about a God who is leading and guiding us. It's not something I have done any work on, but if I were you, I would look. I think Casey might have a book coming out in the next year on AI and preaching. So that would be where I would steer you. On On the issue of being driven by context in our preaching, these are the kinds of questions in the coaching world, and using if you were to use the four codes, where we would talk about being a contextual interpreter and want to talk together about the issues that it presents. And the one that you raised is precisely one of the really profound ones. We feel the deep need to address these things, but there are so many of them. And so the decision, I think it was Cardinal Newman who talked about the illative sense. How do we develop homiletical judgment? This was what he was talking about, developing good theological judgment about which of these issues to sort of take on, and perhaps to think about ways in which they are intersectional, and in fact, where we don't have to deal with this one this week and this one next, but the ways in which they are caught up together, and so that we can decide on fewer of these kinds of contextual issues, and think of ways to sort of organize them a little better. It is tough, though, because if you're driven by a contextual hermeneutic in your own life and in your own practice of preaching, it's the same. I mean, different issues are raised for someone who's driven by a theological hermeneutic. How does every sermon not be about the same theological, so we have to raise that same kind of question as a practicing preacher. But I think at least one opportunity there is to think about the ways in which these issues are intersectional in nature and not just discrete. Yeah.
So Christine, I'm just going to add, in April there'll be a major conference on AI and theology here.
Oh, good.
You may want to, you can come back or watch it online. I think it'll be broadcast online. So that's being organized by Jennifer Hurd, Kathy Tanner, and John Beecher.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's great.
A couple of quick things. So when we are dismissed, if you're interested, we have an unusual partnership between one of our current students and an alum who are doing orientations to the library. And the alum planted all of the vegetation around the library out there. Chris is very talented. So you can go down there, and I think this is just kind of come when you can. I don't think you have to be there a precise time, that's my understanding. But that's be well worth doing. There will be chapel here at 11:30 this morning. Then there's lunch over in the refectory, and the alumni awards ceremony will be at lunch beginning at 12:30. So you have to eat fast. Just to give you a note about that. I hope you'll join me in once more thanking John. I have to say we're all concerned about the compression of churches that wipe away. And this is an attempt to help us think about one way that we might address that in a very effective way by changing very deliberately
Yeah.